Hi, I'm John. I'm Northwest University alum, and I use he, him pronouns.
Okay, cool. So now we'll give the speakers opportunities to introduce themselves. I don't really need it for speaker point positions, but just in case people want to do pronoun introductions, and so we all know each other. So opening government, who's speaking first?
John, no preference on pronouns.
Okay, speaking second.
Robert, speaking numbers.
Great. Opening opposition.
Opening opposition, we have Sarah speaking first, and second, we'll representative of gender whatever it's called.
Great. Closing government, Regis NACC.
Next, speaking first, speaking position, speaker.
I'm Katie, speaking position as well. Great. Closing opposition, Regis ANSA.
Selling speaking first, no preference.
And speaking second, no preference.
Okay. Great. So without any further ado, I would like to call this house to order and invite the Prime Minister to deliver a speech after 67 minutes in the motion that stands in your name and your hearing.
I want to emphasize the kind of things that an oppressed group went through before the creation of a post-oppression, post-colonial, post-conflict society are horrible. They are horrible things that need to be rectified, and those individuals deserve to see an increase of the quality of life. What we are trying to do by emphasizing and preferring a world with unifying and inspirational art is not to shut down the messages that those individuals might have. Rather, what we are trying to do is to ensure that those individuals can transcend their oppressive past and become a new unified nation and state with its own individual identity, not predicated upon the previous conflict that existed, but predicated on their now current present empowerment. What kind of art are we going to prefer on our side of the house? We want art which emphasizes a new and collective and identity, right? We want art which bridges gaps between cultural and ethnic groups. Both the ethnic groups that existed that were oppressed that also have different kinds of ideas, but also the ethnic groups and the ethnic groups that were oppressing them, right? So we want these narratives to be unifying and inspirational about how we can create a world where the oppressed and the oppressor, the line that exists between those two, can continue to be blurred. What do we have to say that we're not preferring on the opening government? We're not preferring art that shows the events of ethnic cleansing or terrible genocide that existed in the past. And according to the motion, we are also not preferring depicting the current oppression that minorities are suffering due to the remnants of that oppression, right? But we would say we are going to see those individuals have better upward mobility and better increasing of a quality of life and better integration into this society when we stop depicting the remnants of that past and start showing how they can become part of this new unified identity. Before we get into arguments, let's talk about what a post-conflict society looks like, because our argument is going to be why it's especially important to emphasize unifying art within that context. No, thank you. What does this look like? Two main things I want to emphasize. Firstly, they're unsure of a collective or new identity. They've created a state out of thin air where one previously did not exist, or the state that did exist was predicated upon the culture of an oppressive group or colonial group, right? They're oftentimes constructed of several separate groups. The culture which does exist is that remnant of colonialism. This is South Africa had a culture that existed that was based upon the British and Dutch colonialism that existed there for hundreds of years. Secondly, they're still deciding on who has power, right? They're still crafting new elections, trying to elect new individuals into government, or in some cases have power-sharing agreements that mandate that the oppressed group and the oppressive group are going to trade off political positions for a designated period of time. What is our argument then? That in that specific context, we need unifying art more than ever, but I'll take a POI from opening before moving on.
Are you insinuating that in order to transcend the oppression that has been plaguing your people, you need to pretend it never happened and actively restrict yourself from creating art that depicts that horrible experience?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We still need to keep that in the cultural idea that needs to be taught in history books. Individuals in schools need to know about what happened. There still needs to be, in some cases, truth and reconciliation councils. But we're talking about when art exists, what kind of art are we talking about? We're not only talking about statues and paintings. We want the popular movies, the literature of the society, the books that, the fiction books that people are reading, talking about scenarios where the individuals from oppressed and oppressive groups come together and work together on projects, not a society where it depicts the oppressed group destroying the oppressive group destroying the oppressed group. 4 reasons we need unifying art more than ever in these kinds of contexts. The first reason is that art starts generating that unifying narrative, right? Why is this the case? The first reason is that a unifying narrative naturally reaches a broader audience, right? We think it's obvious that oppressive groups don't want to watch, are not as likely to want to consume the art that shows the oppression of the oppressed groups, right? There might even be some individuals on the oppressed group that don't want to watch that kind of, watch those kinds of movies or read those kinds of books because it brings up deeply terrible things about their past. We think if we reach a broader audience when we start creating inspirational narratives that more people are likely to look into. But secondly, we'd say the identity vacuum that exists will latch on to this new identity. This culture wants something to latch onto. This is why many of these countries create new national anthems. They create new flags because these individuals are desperate and starving for a new identity. We want that identity to be unifying, right? But secondly, we would say that by creating unifying art, we start deconstructing the remnants of the colonial past, right? Because we think creating art that is, part of the colonial identity would also be exclusionary, right? So we can't just latch on to the old South African British narrative. We have to create a new one because we don't think latching on to the old narrative is unifying either, right? That means we believe that unifying art must deviate from the oppressive culture, right? But thirdly, we would say that art that emphasizes previous oppression excludes the old oppressive group, right? And we think, why do we care if the oppressive group is identified in things like movies or books, right? Why should we care if they're excluded from the art world? We should exclude them for the terrible, horrible things they do. 3 reasons we don't want them to be excluded. The first reason is that they fragment from society and are less likely to discourse and cooperate on political goals, right? If they fragment to society and create their own art and start consuming their own art and keep their old culture, we think especially in places of power sharing agreements, when their power time comes in, they're less likely to want to assent to the kinds of things that the oppressed group wants to put in or wants to implement. They're more likely to work against that because they see the oppressed group as someone that wants to guilt them and wants the cultural identity to wipe them out completely. That might not be correct, but that's how people respond when you try to guilt them. I think that's probably a bad thing, but that's probably realistic on how people respond, right? But secondly, I'd say they latch onto their own identity and actually perpetuate the colonial identity that existed, even if it exists in small pockets. We think with unifying literature, they're more likely to abandon their old cultural identity and start calling themselves, I'm more of a South African than I am an old British colonial, right? But thirdly, we would say this is especially important because these individuals are in most cases the people who still have the most capital and the most land within that country. So we especially want them to be unified and doing this kind of discourse when they have the most ability to affect change because of the land and money that they own in that country. We need these individuals to want to latch onto an old narrative and abandon their old colonial narrative, right? But fourthly, we would say that oppressive art could actually reify the colonial oppressive narrative that exists. Why? Because we think the oppressed group united around fighting the oppressors, right? For a short period of time, in order to transcend their oppression, they needed to create a temporary identity that was, we are a fighter, we are fighters, we are a group that fights against the oppression that exists towards us, right? But we'd say that when they continue to perpetuate that narrative, when they start coming to power, they continue to reify this kind of dichotomy that exists between oppressed and oppressor. We think what those individuals need to do is saying, no, we are the powerful group now. We have latched on. We are not the individuals that need to fight against this group anymore. We are the individuals who need to discourse with them because we are equals to them. Only when we create art that shows that those individuals are equal do we really think that these post-conflict societies can transcend the oppression that existed in the past. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for those remarks, and I invite the leader of opposition to open up the case for the opposition bench.
Is this someone's phone?
Yeah.
Recording?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Every day at UBC, I walk by a totem pole that depicts the horrors of the residential school system in Canada. Every day, I am reminded of the emotional toll that colonialism put on Indigenous people in Canada. This example, I'm going to go through this example a little bit to take down everything that OG said, and then I'm going to go into our own extension about why art is unidentifiable and that the emotional value of art, we uphold the emotional value of art on our side of the house, and furthermore, how creating normative expectations of art takes away the inherent value of art. So, on their case, I think that the idea of reconciliation pretty much destroys their whole case. Okay, right? we tell you that like in your textbook, in your history book, all you get are facts, right? Like you can understand how many people died, but you can never understand the emotional toll that those deaths took on. Art expresses that emotional toll. Art depicts it, right? And this can lead to a collective healing. By understanding the emotional toll, we're able to come to a collective understanding of what happened, not just on a numbers basis, not just on like a, oh wow, that was really terrible basis, but on an empathetic basis where we can relate to one another, because art expresses something emotional, right? We tell you that this collective healing has real world implications, right? Well, like, first of all, we tell you, it's not the role of art to fix everything in the first place, right? We think that like the act of creating the art is important in and of itself, but we tell you even if you don't buy that and you buy OG's framework, we still win because it creates real world implications. If I understand that residential schools were like the impacts of residential schools, I can better understand issues for Indigenous people in Canada. As a voter, I can make a more informed vote, but more than that, as future leaders, we can create better policy. Numbers don't give that to you. An emotional and empathetic recognition of the horrors of the past, which is like what reconciliation is the way to move forward. Okay, are constructive. First of all, art is unidentifiable, right? We think, we think that like art has this ability to communicate an emotional experience, right? We think that like art has this value of like creating this, of facilitating emotional healing and emotional communication, right? We think it like goes beyond facts and figures, otherwise like why would it exist? But it's like this innate thing, and it's a reflection of us. And furthermore, we think that when you dictate what this looks like, you take away the raw emotional value because you're like creating a level of reason and expectation on the art rather than recognizing its inherent value by depicting that emotion. Okay, we tell you that this ability to depict and communicate is intrinsic to art, and as such, art is a specific thing. I don't want to say an actor, but the artist is a specific actor that can communicate the emotional pain that the people have gone through, right? Like art should not create unity. That's the thing, is that like every artist's experience is different. Our goal is not to create unity. Our goal is to enlighten and heal society and create like an empathetic emotional bond. So first of all, we do this in 2 ways. First of all, the artist's own healing. Second of all, the enlightenment of society, and like a third part that deals with their framework. Okay, we tell you that like an artist's own healing, the act of making art expresses an experience, it expresses an emotion, and by confronting that emotion, the artist is able to confront their own trauma and get to a place of healing. The first step is to recognize what you have gone through and understand it in order to move forward. Otherwise, you're like stuck with like awful nightmares or like things like this. Like as we understand PTSD and things and other like mental implications of this, like we know this better, but we think that like just like intrinsically there's a value to understanding your own emotional state. We think that like the pressure to just like move past that ignores the trauma, and we think this is harmful because society will continue to carry that trauma without a way to express it through something like art. Furthermore, we tell you that there's an enlightenment of society when the artist creates this. We tell you that the whole society just went through trauma, and the ability to create art, to communicate with one another about that trauma, even if it's not all the same, allows for a collective healing. It allows for a collective emotional act with a collective emotional response to move forward. We tell you that like you need an emotional response to this emotional thing. Finally, we tell you that there is a need to share individual experiences, right? They tell you that like we should just like focus on the collective, but we tell you that like everybody's experience in art of war is different, and that sharing those individual experiences allows us to have a broader understanding of art and thus take broader lessons from the war to do things like maybe not create those power structures again opening.
Okay, so why can't communication of emotion and experience also be unifying? Why can't my emotion be one of love for the new country? Why can't my experience be one of inspiration by the fact that the oppression has been transcended?
Okay, we think that like by putting this pressure on somebody's trauma to all look the same, you're taking away their individual experience of that trauma. We think that like all of society should recognize and validate all of those different experiences, right? We tell you that art is uniquely able to do this because it is an emotional thing and specifically can communicate those emotions. So now why do normative expectations take away from the value of art? We tell you that like art is inherently is meant to push boundaries, and when you put expectations on art, you don't allow it to do this, right? Like in the Renaissance, there was this expectation of portraits, and like Impressionism broke that, right? We tell you that like movements in art break old movements in order to depict new and present experiences, right? So like the Romanticism before World War I changed afterwards because collectively, disappeared because collectively we'd experienced World War I and and knew that like nature and war wasn't to be glorified, right? So we think that with a lack of expectations, we're able to push boundaries. If you want like the kind of benefits that OG wants, we tell you that this allows groups to advocate for themselves, right? Like activism in art is about pushing boundaries, and if you have those expectations, you can't push boundaries. Furthermore, we tell you that there's like a lack of questioning in the new society. If you say like we only need unifying narratives, then people can't step outside of them. We tell you that by putting pressure on art, you leave out the emotional response by creating a layer of reasoning, which stops it from pushing boundaries and makes it no longer art, and on their side, they're no longer able to access the benefits of art because it's no longer art.
I think the speaker proposed a represented by the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the opening government. Hear, hear.
We don't deny that art is an important experience for people. I think a lot of the way that people find their identities is by listening to music or watching movies or seeing something visually that compels them to do something that they otherwise wouldn't have do. The question in this debate is not whether or not you identify with art, whether or not it emotes a particular experience. The question is what kind of art you want to create. And simply saying that making art that unifies a public that can transcend past the colonial structures that were imposed by them, the societies that were ripped apart by circumstances that were imposed on them and that they couldn't control. That art has to be unifying in a way so that the society can move forward and move beyond the trauma. The only way to reconcile trauma with your current experience is to be able to find a way to move beyond the resentment that was imposed on you in the past. We're going to tell you two things. First, let's have a conversation about what unites a society, because I think that is crucially missing from these debates, which are incredibly textualized by lots of things that were ignored from John's speech. Then we're going to tell you how this art looks. We're going to get specific and talk about what these conflicts would have looked like if art had emphasized the characteristics that they would have wanted to. So, first, what unites a society? John told you a couple of incredibly crucial things that should not have been ignored by the opposition. These are remnants of groups that were bitterly in conflict. They were agrarian conflicts in places like South Sudan. They were ethnic conflicts in places like Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. They were colonial resistances in Sierra Leone and former Arab states taken over by the Arab Spring. The point of this is to say that these were groups that, yes, had conflict and trauma inflicted on them by other groups who were responsible for lots and lots of things. But there wasn't violence only on one side, right? There are lots and lots of disparate makeups of these groups that contributed to these particular conflicts in a way that it is inaccurate and disingenuous to say that we should make art about the group that oppressed us because they deserve to remain culpable for their actions. In many cases, these were phenomenally, complicated events that transcended, that we still don't actually know all of the information about, even after many of the Truth and Reconciliations that were commissioned after those. Second of all, they are defined by colonial structures. This is going to be incredibly important in this debate. In many cases, ethnic conflict is artificial. It is created out of thin air. That is to say that Hutus and Tutsis lived alongside each other quite peacefully until the colonialists came into Rwanda and told them that the minority group was going to be empowered at the expense of the majority, that told them that they weren't able to prosper unless they got into conflict with one another. In many cases, those divisions did not exist prior to, but that is the history that you would force yourself to emphasize on your side of the house. They would say that, yes, there is culpability on one side, and we need to make sure that people can heal from that. The problem is that those conflicts were artificial in the first place. Why is this important? This becomes important when you talk about what to do about it. First thing we would say here is that people have a right to be able to escape an identity that was forced on them, right? So this is to say that people in Rwanda have the right to vote for Paul Kagame and move on to policies that were going to benefit the vast majority of the nation. Why is that important? I think if you emphasize the kind of art the opening opposition and the government opposition bench wants to on your side of the House, it incentivizes a particular kind of nepotism and resentment in form of the governments that come into power. This is to say that the government of Robert Mugabe, who came into power in Zimbabwe, focused all of his attention and all of the narratives, quite literally created government-sponsored media and government-sponsored art depicting the former powers that they previously took over in a revolution as awful individuals. They depicted paintings of them killing other individuals and plastered them all over the walls of a society. And as a result of that, they were able to focus on policies that demonized them. They were land reforms that completely crippled the economy. They were discriminatory policies that disenfranchised many of the same groups that were traumatized during that conflict previously. This is to say that if you focus on what happened before, based on many different situations that accrue as a result of these extremely complicated contexts, you turn a society against each other and allow a government to never move on and create policies that benefit the vast majority of people. They are exclusionary and they are discriminatory as a result of the colonial forces that were imposed on them, right? You need to be able to stitch together the social fabric so they do not re-engage in a conflict. I'm going to get more into this later when I talk about what this art looks like, but I think there are many other ways that you can achieve quite very much the same benefits that you get on the opposition side of the House, right? So we just took out about 5% of the case. Let's take out the rest of the 95. Things like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions get about 70% of what they want. These were not just facts and numbers talking about how many people died. They were people who lived in Zulu farms in the northern part of South Africa crying on television in front of individuals talking about the specific experiences that traumatized them, talking about the white colonial powers that took away their land in 1932 and never gave them back. They are stories shared by elders. They are stories shared by families passed down through generations so that people got to understand the trauma that was inflicted on them. They are textbooks and education centers, quite very much the same way that you talk about in your case of opening opposition, that tell people specifically about what happened. There are legal accountability and mechanisms of legal accountability through things like the ICC that took war criminals to trial, made them talk about what they did, and then outed the rest of the people who committed those war crimes so we could learn specifically what happened. That's how you heal a nation. You actually find the people who were held accountable, not leave the jury to a bunch of people who did not understand those particular conflicts as a result of the impositions that were put on them in the very first place. Back half.
Okay, that's cool, but why is it that art uniquely as a mechanism is sufficient to overcome the power dynamics and disparities? You say it's inherent within the school.
Oh, what a perfect transition to my second point. What does the art look like on either side of the point? Here's what happens on your side of the house, right? When you have movies that vilify the white minority in places like South Africa, you rattle back up those tensions and remind people of the trauma that was reimposed onto them, even after they were probably able to heal from them as a result of the many mechanisms that we talked about on our side of the house. Opening opposition says that art is important for emotional experience and a collective healing. That does not heal individuals. It re-traumatizes them and it foments resentment in societies that want to escape that very persecution in the very first place. They are songs that blame certain groups for harm committed on both sides. You cannot heal without reconciling trauma and looking forward. They say, we don't want to take away people's individual experiences. It's better to allow them to create one that was their own, not one that was forced upon them by people they have no idea about. What do we do on our side of the house? When you emphasize things like the natural beauty of a state, when you emphasize the inspirational, hardworking ethic of individuals, you can rebuild that state. Because you compel us to heal by looking to what we can achieve and what we can do without the imposition of a history that we did not choose, of a history that oppressed us and put us down. Yes, that was traumatic. Yes, that was awful. And we regret all of those particular instances of colonialism that forced these states to become post-conflict in the first place. But the way to rectify those traumas and those injustices is not to focus on them. It is to heal through legal mechanisms and formal mechanisms and move on by creating art that brings a whole bunch of different groups together so that they can unite and move forward and leave their colonial past that they didn't choose behind. We are incredibly proud to propose, ladies and gentlemen.
Sorry, I'm just like grappling with this space. It's very strange. Don't mind me. Your trauma does not have to be inspirational. That is not a burden that you as an individual or you as a collective who has been through a traumatic experience, I think we all agree that oppression and conflict are probably traumatic experiences. Your pain is valid, your pain is yours, whether as an individual or as a group. It is yours to share, it is yours to create, it is yours to express, it is yours to use to heal, it is yours to use to communicate if you so choose. What side government wants in this debate is to curtail the ability of art to be used to heal, to promote discourse, to acknowledge the wrongs that have been done, which is so contingent to being able to move on. And even if it is not contingent to being able to move on, although I think broadly we all agree that it is, there is still a value in creating that art for the individuals and for the groups creating it in the first place. What am I going to do for you in this speech? Firstly, I'm just going to kind of like go through this idea of what we get from opening government in this debate about like how we kind of transcend this past and like what this looks like in terms of like triggering, and as well as like talking about how art uniquely expresses emotion in a way that other things cannot, as well as the kind of case tension that we get when Robert starts to say to you, hey, like if we have this traumatic art, you'll basically like ruin society's entire ability to be able to heal, but also like let's go through this trauma in every way except art when we talk about it and create stories about it and pass it on, because like somehow this will have no negative impact. He never tells us why art is different and why art is problematic. What we bring to you in opposition is why art is uniquely beneficial. That is an important distinction to be made. Then I'm going to go through the questions in the first half of this debate. What do these conflicts look like? How does colonialism come into play? As well as like how does the idea of inspiration and unification interact with the concept of art? We tell you that like these things are kind of at odds with each other in a lot of cases. And then more broadly, what kind of narrative do we as a society want to push post-conflict when our goal is like probably broadly healing? Cool. So like, they tell you that in order to like transcend an oppressive past, you need to form a new national identity and a new state, new and collective. They tell you don't depict oppression, don't depict the remnants of the past. Now, I ask a POI where I say, does this insinuate that in order to transcend your oppression, oppressed groups should like not create art and can't focus on growth and healing as a group and dealing with their trauma and processing that? And they say, we don't say that, we so don't say that. But we say don't create art that depicts your oppression because of like reasons. So like we tell you that it's exactly what you say, right? They tell you that it could be like dealing with like people's sensitivities and triggering. We say this is like art has a huge value for healing. You're also able to opt out so as not to be massively triggered, right? Like we're not like saying that you should like plaster the entire city with like gruesome depictions of war and like traumatize everyone forcibly. Like that's not how art really operates in most cases, right? They tell you, and I lost the page where I said that, but it's super spicy content, right? They tell you that one of the reasons that you should not do this is because it is bad for whichever group is being depicted as the oppressor, right? Because when you are depicted as the oppressor, you probably have land, you probably have money, you're probably going to be pissed off, you're probably going to be negatively impacted. They say that we need to care about the feelings of the oppressors. When you say that they have land and money and therefore we should keep them happy, this puts the burden on previously marginalized groups to do the emotional labor of denying their own trauma, actively not expressing their own trauma in order to like avoid having a divisive future, right? This is not transcending oppression. This is not creating equality. This is not moving on in any way, shape or form. When you have been a part of a victimized group and you want to express your pain and you want that pain to be validated, it is not fair and it is not equitable and it is not productive in any way, shape or form, as Sarah tells you when she talks to you about the trauma that is required for truth and reconciliation to happen in a genuine kind of way, to say, hey, this is a specific way that you are allowed to deal with your trauma. Hey, this is a specific way that we would like really prefer you not deal with your trauma. That's not how trauma works, right? Processing of trauma is an individual experience. People need to be able to have autonomy in order to do that, right? Sarah tells you specifically how, like, this applies not only to trauma in general, but specifically to art, insofar as art is unique, a uniquely wonderful mechanism that allows you to do these things.
The problem is for that to be able to operate as a mechanism, you have to have the oppressive group wanting to jump into that discourse. We see in the status quo, like right-wing people see discourse about oppression as like white guilt conspiracy, right? You need to prove why everybody has the stance of a liberal when they pass the totem pole and doesn't just look at it and say this is exclusionary.
My pain is distinct from your crime. I think it is possible in a lot of instances to depict the pain that you feel, to depict the feeling that you feel, to depict the trauma that you have gone through, to depict the isolation or the pain or whatever it is, or the sadness or the loss or the grief that you have for the trauma, for the conflict that has occurred. It is possible to do that without like actively drawing like Hitler standing there with like a little like mustache on and like all like people who identify with that and everyone knew that was bad, right? Like that's not the same. We see that very powerful art occurs without identifying necessarily an aggressor. It is mostly about, and often the most healing art is about the feelings of the victim and the way that they change and the way that they move on, right? When you go to the 9/11 museum, for example, you see the impact on the victims. You see the victims' pain. You see their right to healing. You see the depictions of how people have felt about that. You don't see like posters of like, oh, this is who the bad person in this was. That's not what was trying to heal. I don't think that was unclear or needs clarification. Right. So what do we tell you? We tell you that art uniquely expresses emotion in a way that historic accounts do not. And we've already told you that they're quite happy for like there to be kind of all kinds of traumatic discussions and passing on of stories on their side of the house. Then they tell you that you can't do that in art because that is really bad. I've already told you this, right? But we tell you specifically that the act of creating art is incredibly important because it brings catharsis, it brings communication. Oftentimes it is a collaborative experience with people who have the same experience as you, the same shared experience as you, which is not necessarily all of society, right? We tell you art creates emotion and depicts pain. It shows pain and experience, especially as that pain and experience lingers in terms of the like continually existing emotional, social, and institutionalized ways that the conflict or pre-conflict or post-conflict world has actually impacted these individuals, right? This experience is not going to be universalized. This experience is not like in the past. This experience is probably broadly like continuing through that trauma, and we think that it is valid, acceptable, and even encouraged to continue to represent that. What does it look like when we constrain art? We tell you that things like impressionism, things like abstract art, things like cubism consistently push the boundaries of what art is, what art should be. We tell you that like women of color, when they create art, people of color who create cultural art, are like often decried as like not being proper artists and not doing the right thing and pushing the boundaries. We tell you that the nature of art is to push boundaries and is to question people and is to do things that make you think and make you feel, even if they create negative emotions. We tell you that that is fine. So how does the idea of inspiration and unification interact with the concept of the phenomenon of art? We tell you, when you ask the question of what kind of emotions should we be communicating in art, your side breeds exclusivity, right? You have the right to escape your identity, as you say, but you also have the right to embrace it, to embrace that pain, to use that as a tool. You do not get to tell people that you prefer that they feel in a specific way. Truth and reconciliation requires an acknowledgement of pain. In order to focus, we are proud to oppose.
I think that opening opposition has truly missed the comparative in today's debate. That is, that we believe that art exists and it is in fact an automatic expression of the things that we feel and naturally proliferates within society, and today's debate is not about any policy implementation. Rather, what the opposition has to do, and hopefully back half will do it for us, is show us why, yes, art that depicts suffering can be good, but why uniquely is art that depicts suffering good, preferential in proliferation for the advancement of post-conflict societies. There is yet to be a unique benefit that shows us that art mechanistically can serve as a function for the progression of democracies and the sustainability of post-conflict societies. Katie and I will prove to you why, in lieu of the motion talking about societies, we'll show you that art, uniquely good art that proliferates in this area, is uniquely beneficial and necessary to the development of these post-conflict societies. Quick refutation. Actually, just slow all of that refutation, and then we'll go across as I go through a positive matter. Individuals are products of the larger social context that they are brought out of. The debate we are having today is about what kind of culture do we want to define a post-conflict society. It is a story about the narratives, motifs, language, vernacular that gets proliferated after post-conflict societies. It's a narrative about what units of cultural products do we want to be common after atrocity has broken out. First point of positive matter. I want to talk to you about the way individuals can have their identity constituted for them with the proliferating rhetoric that surrounds them, specifically in post-conflict societies. You can just tag this as constitutive rhetoric. The type of cultural product that will define post-conflict societies directly has a result on the individuals that find themselves thrown into the societies. Notice first how individuality and the notion of an individual arises. A person is first violently thrown or born into a system that they do not choose. They are born into post-conflict societies and immediately bear with them a mark or some warrant of what their ideal existence now is. We are not saying to divorce oneself from one's history, but rather to view one's history as not an area for ramifications or remnants and suffering and these conflicts, but as a deep source of cultural pride and beauty. We tell you that art works uniquely in post-colonial and post-conflict times, and that we have to understand how individuals react to art. This is very much a debate about what to do with the remaining propaganda after we have issues like South American apartheid goes away. There is proliferation of street art and propaganda that surrounds the areas people have taken to the street, and the art isn't art about the conflict during that time. Remember that during post-conflict societies, there is no lack of art. It's not a question about what art do we create afterwards because now we have the time. It's a question about what art do we want to define these times. There is art that defines post-conflict. There's an art that defines conflict times. During conflict, there is art. You can see it. The question then arises, whenever we try to work towards reconciliation, what best art helps us attain that goal? It is important to remember that individuals that rise in post-conflict societies can never truly see themselves as citizenry or individuals of a society, insofar as the art that we think needs to be proliferated is one that highlights past atrocities and tells them that your identity as an individual is uniquely situated in the suffering that you've experienced or your ancestors have experienced. We have to create narratives of self that propagate us as beneficial uniquely and at the same time part of a global society. Think things like Black Girl Magic and Black Boy Joy. Portraying oneself as inherently valuable, not in light of suffering, but because of suffering, and using those as unifying and inspirational messages. Think of things like the fatigue that one can encounter by going through these different systems, and also recognize that the ability to create art and policy is reciprocal. That is, the individuals who are on the opposing side or the wrong side of conflicts also have the capacity, also have the power to create art. Our question is also for them. What kind of art do we want individuals who are on the abusing side or the colonial side to be creating in these societies? It is rather one of unity, not to the messages that they proliferated. This definitely looks like in the American South getting rid of statues that portray the reality of the suffering of that time because they glorify and lionize different leaders who do not deserve to be lionized, but rather replacing those with areas that show unifying messages of global solidarity. Second issue, go ahead, back up.
Okay, but when you create this unifying art, creates a narrative that we have unified and liberated people from that crime, the structure still exists. You don't change them.
Great. Second point of positive matter. The reality of transitional justice. Recognize now that these societies that are post-conflict are yet at the end characterized as not perfect. They are going through positionary transitions of post-conflict to stable democracies. And that transition of transitional justice is a precarious one. And everything down to the art in that society or the cultural products that we proliferate are important to how that society will go forward. If what PACAP want to bring to us is a stable idea of how the society functions, they ought to invest in the units of cultural production that get us to that point in the first place. Recognize that transitional societies have A, extreme skepticism about authority and government systems. B, ill feelings that can trigger conflicts on both sides insofar as weeks and months after post-conflict treaties begin. And they drain cultural resources. They also create existential sentiments about one's group identity and where they belong. Post-transitional societies are necessary for trust and reconciliation and truth. I know that sounds difficult, and it's a set of hard-to-swallow pills, but think back to South Africa after the apartheid movement, when reconciliation and truth only worked because of the sincere authenticity that opposing parties had, and being willing to say, we are going to accept remittances and accept forgiveness if we both have ideas that we agree on. But South Africa only asked for redress and saying messages like, you won't use the K word, and will proliferate ideas about a global South African citizen. Now the individuals who are receiving in their hate can also identify as not just a person who is part of a conflict, but also as a unified part of a South Africa. This creates ties to communities, and it helps to to advance the idea that there is hope and peace and unity. The alternative is tribalism, to believe that inherently by merit of my position as an individual, I necessarily stand in opposition to some other person, some other force. It deteriorates hope and ideas of global solidarity. It eradicates the notion of a unified citizen, a person who can actually buy into a responsible nationalism by virtue of their country and what the country has worked to give them as far as redress goes. We can also show that art, in the same point, has an actual place in democratic deliberation. Art is powerful. It is a question of how do we harness and redirect the power that art produces as a tool to create sustainable global democracies in these post-conflict areas. What art has to prove to you is not just why art that depicts suffering is good. We will concede that on some level, that definitely does happen, and it will happen on either today's house. The question is, how as a tool do you want to use cultural units of products to advance global societies and create sustainable democracies? Positive art does that by creating positive messages.
I thank the speaker for those remarks, and I invite the member of opposition to open up the background to the opposition. Everyone ready? Honorable panel, we think that it's really interesting that side government's case so far completely hinges and exists in a vacuum where we rely on the assumption that there has been 100% liberation in post-conflict societies. We tell you that there is no such thing as 100% liberation, regardless of if you are post-conflict or not. What we tell you is that a majority of oppression that exists today is due to prior oppression in the past and due to that conflict. So what we tell you is that a majority of their analysis falls through when they come to when they tell you things like the right to escape an identity that is forced upon them is expressed through art that unifies and has a unifying message, and when they tell us that we effectively vilify the oppressor when we create this kind of art. What we tell you is that this needs to happen, if anything, because all of the oppression that exists today is a result of historical oppression that has existed in the past. All of their analysis falls through up to this point. Okay, if art depicts unification without true resolution of cultural and institutional dynamics of oppression, then motion adoption will only re-entrench society in this dynamic of exploitation and subjugation. It is an illusion of change, and that is what a majority of my positive matter will hinge upon. Okay. With that being said, we are so proud to propose. Go ahead. Whoever.
Okay, I'm willing to accept that art has a place. Art that depicts suffering has a place in society. Just to demonstrate why art that depicts suffering is necessary for peacekeeping and nation building in post-conflict societies. You have to use the prefer and tell me what your standard for preferring is.
Okay, I will get to that in my impacts, and I'm going to explain to you how art that accurately depicts the suffering of an oppressed people effectively destroys, one, the illusion of change, and two, the creation of detrimental hope that just further subjugates populations. With that being said, I'm going to go into my positive matter. So everyone in this debate so far has conceded that art influences culture, right? OO goes to the extent of telling you that it is an emotional experience on the personal level. What we tell you is that when you experience it through collective society, it creates cultural beliefs and perceptions of the relationship to the other. We think that this is extremely important. At the point where art can influence the relationship that you believe that you have with the other, and art is then sending this message that there is unification, we think that that is problematic. At the point where you want to create the narrative of unification before there is true liberation, we think that that is a detrimental, immobilizing force. With that being said, let's go into my point. We think that when art unifies, rather than creating an accurate depiction of suffering, two things happen. One, it has a masking effect of the true
oppression that still exists due to prior oppression or conflict. And second, it creates and promotes a narrative of hope. We think that both of these things are extremely detrimental. First, let's go into my point about the illusion of change and why this masking effect is problematic. 1. The illusion of change, 1, sends the narrative that there has been 100% liberation within societies. What we tell you is that that's extremely problematic. At the point where you believe that your subjugation has ended, we think that this then acts as a form of immobilization within society. It creates no true access to upward social mobility at the point where you know that you are being subjugated, but everybody else believes that you are not because of art that is telling you that there should be unity and inspiration. This inspirational quote that says, oh, don't worry about it, it's fine, like there's no such thing as oppression anymore, so you don't have to fight for it. So we think that that's the narrative that exists on their side of the house when you allow art to be restricted to that. What we tell you is that we would prefer art that accurately depicts the liberation, that accurately depicts not only the oppression, but the process of liberation from, and now inspires you for liberation for. What do I mean for that? Let's take the United States, for example. There has been liberation from slavery, right? We think that there needs to be liberation for equality now, at the point where we depict art that accurately shows the depiction of slavery. We think that will mobilize people for the liberation for equality in society, right? With that being said, let's go into my next point. The point about why hope is bad. Why does it matter? Why does it matter that inspirational art and art that sends the message of unification provides hope? We tell you that at the point where we recognize that there has not been 100% liberation reached within society, especially post-conflict societies, we must recognize that hope creates the false belief that change will come if we wait. This is extremely important. This is another immobilizing factor within society. At the point where a group has been further subjugated by the promise of hope, it then means that they have no action to do to create upward social mobility for themselves in the first place. Please sit down. What we tell you is that at the point where hope where we have created a narrative of hope, where we have created a narrative that tells you that you can get past this if you just wait, which is a lot of the language that we get coming out of opposition, mind you. What we tell you is that waiting is not good enough. There needs to be action. We think that the visceral reaction that OO depicts for you tells you about how this will create an actual mobilization factor within oppressed groups specifically. Like when Kendrick Lamar raps about the way the hood is, when he performs at the Grammys literally wearing a prison uniform and tells you about the prison industrial complex. We think that these are beautiful examples of an anti-hope narrative that needs to be spread, especially among oppressed groups. So, what does that mean? We tell you that art that depicts suffering destroys the concept of hope. What does that mean? When we destroy this narrative of hope that effectively immobilizes people for their own upward social mobility, we tell you that this when we effectively destroy that by creating the visceral reaction of showing you what you've gotten liberation from and what you need to get liberation for, we think that we effectively explain to you why it is that you need to mobilize. One of the best examples of this was during the campaign. During Donald Trump's campaign, video journalists decided to compile videos of people who had been pushed out, like examples of actual violent slavery, people being pushed in the streets, African Americans being spit on, and then comparing that to what happened at Trump rallies, right? This is a wonderful depiction, a beautiful piece of art showing you and vilifying the white majority, right? We think that this is necessary because why? It mobilized African Americans to be able to recognize what was happening in society, mobilize them for their own liberation. Liberation from is not enough. Liberation for is what we need to strive for. And at the point where 100% liberation does not exist, we need to abandon the narrative of hope. For that reason, we are proud to oppose.
Those remarks, I invite the document web to close out the document science. I'd just like to count
encounter the member of government or opposition, whatever, Sally is what I'm going to call her, because she's my best friend in the whole world, with a joke, because I have hope that I'm going to win this round, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Alright, so first I'm going to show you how Nick and I win this round using 3 crystallizing questions. First question, the top half debate, is art for the individual? No. Second question, what you just get out of Sally, does hope inhibit change? Also no. Third question that you get out of Nick, the only answer to which the answer is yes, is art a cultural unit that can create a better future? Yes. So what goes down in the top half of debate? As per usual, Robert and John do an excellent job with setting up the debate, giving us the general definitions, and showing why art is and has a very important influence on society. They tell you it can reach a broad audience, it can give people an identity when they're looking for something to struggle with. They tell you ethnic conflict is defined by colonial imposition, and people have a right to escape identities that was forced on them from outside, right? We think that these are all really great things to say, but we think Nick really hammers down all their points, because because we think that their points are more general and not necessarily focused on the lens of art. What Nick tells you is that in transitional societies, the catalyzing art that we want to define the times with is key, right? He refocuses their analysis through the lens of the motion and shows you why all of their analysis is correct, especially when it comes to art, especially when it comes to cultural artifacts in a post-conflict society. This is how Nick kind of ends up taking that ground away from them. We think they did a good job on it. We think Nick finishes it by putting it through the lens of the motion. So what we get from opening opposition is we can never understand the emotional toll that other groups went through in conflicts, and we need art. What Nick and I would posit to you is that we can never understand that emotional toll anyways. We agree with that completely. So what we think art ought to do is teach us to recognize the value of all individuals in a society, rather than telling us hey, maybe somehow you will understand me and then we can create a lasting peace. No, let's just start on the same page rather than trying to have oppressors and oppressed people trying to understand each other. We also think opening opposition kind of beats themselves on this, right? Because they say art is needed for individual catharsis. This is a huge point of theirs, but somehow it also validates that on a large scale oppressors are validated, and somehow it also validates on a large scale that their oppression matters. No, we don't think you can have one. We don't think you can have both. We think you have to have one or the other. Either art is for individual catharsis, and that's what makes it powerful, or it's a cultural force. And we think that back half government or opposition does a much better job of saying this is why art is a cultural force, and that. But we still think Nick ends up winning on this because Nick does the one thing that no one else does in this debate. It's a little bit of a spoiler, but Nick shows the innate harm of the art that op wants. I'm going to tell you how he does that when I get to him in my speech. So why does Nick end up winning the top half debate for you guys? Nick uses real world examples of inclusion in post-conflict societies when he talks about South Africa and the necessity of transitional democracies, and he shows why OG's logic applies to the motion through this. Nick explains the difficult work of forgiveness that is necessary to create lasting peace, and he shows why art has a unique place in doing that other cultural artifacts just don't have. He also shows why societal benefits are always greater than personal benefits. So even if you think that art is valuable for an individual person, what Nick tells you is that art creates our identity as a society, thus making it more important on a societal level. So on to the question of the member of opposition, Sally. What does she bring you? She tells you that hope inhibits change. Nick and I say this is absolutely false, right? So what Sally tells you is first, we need true 100% liberation or change is illusory. And what Nick and I will tell you is that you cannot have true resolution without all groups being included. There is something revolutionary about unity in post-conflict societies. It pushes us to value everyone and break the dichotomy of conflict. When Nick explains to you that our identities are constituted from the moment we're born and we don't choose them, we think this is an inherent harm of the motion, right? But we think you can change how your identity has been constituted using art, using the cultural artifacts that we build. We don't think that you can ever reach 100% liberation. We think that the best option and the most pragmatic option to help people on a ground level is to make it so that we can all start on the same page. This is really what Nick brings to you. And then he tells you so this kind of more on the 100% liberation thing, we think Nick already answers this in his second point of positive matter. He tells you it's not perfect, it's transitional, and the reality of transitional justice is that it is messy and it requires all of us to make sacrifices. Those sacrifices include forgiving those who hurt us. They include wanting to move forward with them as part of our movements, right? The moment of transition in post-conflict society, this is the uniqueness of the motion, right? The moment of transition allows us to do something different, and re-entrenching oppression through prevalent art ensures that we are trapped in the patterns of the past and that they are more likely to be rewritten. This is the inherent harm of the art that opposition wants that no one else in the round points out to you. Nick shows to you why art that ties to past oppression will enable us, has an inherent harm because it ties us to those oppressors and it ties us to the harms of the past, which we are trying to escape in a post-conflict society. If we want things to be different, we cannot keep referring to the past. We must refer to the future, and the future can only be positive if everyone is included, even the oppressors. So then Sally tells you, like, the promise of hope is negative and an anti-hope narrative is needed. Lasting peace cannot be created without people buying in, and that means everyone. This is what Nick uniquely tells you in the motion. Finally, on this analysis of freedom for, not freedom from. We need freedom to value everyone on face, and the first step toward liberation is freedom from conflictual dichotomies that put us in boxes and constitute our identities in ways that we never planned. Yes.
Okay, the motion says that we have to show that non-unifying art has value, which we've done. But let's deal with your burden. We tell you that by creating an emotional understanding of each other, we ultimately get a better outcome by your burden.
Okay, so we think that Nick proves to you why in a post-conflict society there's uniqueness. We need to take the work of transitional societies, and that work is harmful. We don't think the opposition ever proves why, like, this art is more helpful. So now finally on to what Nick brings you uniquely in his case, right? So he says that individuals are products of the social constructs they are part of. I referred to this many times, right? People don't choose to be born into the situations they are or with the identity they are, and we use cultural artifacts such as art as the only route with which to change that identity, with which to create a new identity that we choose for ourselves. Individuals on both sides will create art. This is another huge point that Nick brings, and the only harm that anyone really puts on the debate toward the other side. He tells you that, like, oppressive art shows the power of the oppressor, it links oppressed people back to that oppressor, and it lionizes them. Nick gives you this harm. It's incredibly important in this debate. He's the only person in this debate who shows the actual harm of the other side and not just the benefits of our side, winning the clash on that measure. So Nick then tells you the realities of transitional justice. He tells us that conflict drains resources and boxes in identities, and we need to do the hard work of forgiveness in order to change a culture and allow everyone to buy in. Hope necessitates the buy-in of everyone. Without everyone, we cannot buy in, right? Nick shows how the uniqueness of post-conflict societies means art must be unified. He shows how forgiveness is needed to create justice in a new culture and to make a better society for everyone, and how if art has a unique place in culture, and basically, without art, you can't create lasting peace. That art must be unified because of how its role in our identity. We think that obviously back government takes this debate. Thank you very much.
I think those remarks, and I invite the opposition move to close out this debate.
In the pursuit of a better future, I close my eyes to my constant suffering, to my current suffering. I hope that one day things will get better. I hope, and I allow this constant suffering to occur until one day, 100 years from now, something different happens. But unfortunately, that doesn't change. I stay waiting for change to occur, but I constantly suffer. What we say is, unless you address the fundamental dynamics of oppression that occur within the status quo, that you don't change on your side of the house, you will always be left in a state of suffering. Your change is illusory, and we reject that change. 3 submating questions in today's debate. First, is unifying art healing? No. Second, does inspirational art produce better societies? No. Finally, is a culture of hope bad? Abso-fucking-lutely. So first question, is unifying art healing? No. We get this predominantly from opening government when they tell you that what we need as a people in a post-conflict society is a new identity that we can rally behind, that we can formulate. The only problem is you're actually coercing these people into this new identity. Why is that the case? 2 reasons. First, the environment that they just left is extremely unstable. They're experiencing oppression. It's chaotic. They want some type of stability. What do? You say, join in and make this concession to your oppressors and unify with them so that way you have a stable form of identity. We don't think this is a free choice and we reject it on that basis alone. Secondarily, does it really lead to new change? We don't think so. We think the type of change you're saying is that you'll produce some type of inspirational unification between oppressor and oppressed, but that will necessarily produce a better future that is void of oppressive dynamics. We don't think you ever provide the analysis as to why you resolve those fundamental disparities between powers and resources, right? We think if you don't, then at best what this art does is it creates a false concession on a collective stage that somehow changes occur. We think this leaves them in a double bind. Either one, it legitimizes the oppression that's currently experienced by the oppressed within the society, or two, there's absolutely no change and people still aren't going to get along. We don't think you can make the change, this change in ethnic identity is going to necessarily produce any meaningful change. And for that reason, we don't think opening government is going to get very far. But luckily they have their closing government to help them out when they talk about producing better societies, which leads me to my secondary question is, does inspirational art produce better societies? The answer to that, no as well. Why is that the case? Nicholas tells you that peacekeeping and nation building is uniquely important during this transitional period. The only problem is you're not going to create the type of democracy that we want to live in when you really entrench it in power dynamics that necessarily lead to a further oppression, right? Why do they lead that? We've POI'd over and over for after round. Opposition has made the case over and over again that you don't resolve the fundamental disparities between groups within the society. At best, you create a false depiction of how they are now getting along with their oppressors or how their oppressors are going to get along with them. Their premise is that if you're able to coax the oppressors into cooperating with the oppressed, it'll lead to liberation. But why would they necessarily have an incentive to change things if the oppressed have already made this concession? We think if that's the case in the society, the transitional period you have, all like emotion adoption is going to do is create some type of stability that will lead to further nation building, but that nation building, again, would be re-entrenched in these power dynamics topics.
The comparative on your side is worse because the art resurfaces resentment and toxic emotions that motivate people to relive their hatred, not look for systematic change. We don't have to sympathize with oppressors, and like you can just find common characteristics by which to unite behind. Don't strawman our case, engage with the material.
We're not strawmanning your case, you just haven't given us a unique reason as to why unifying art uniquely creates an effect that leads to liberation. We think that's your burden, not ours. But that's actually a great transitionary question. Is a culture of hope necessarily bad? We don't think so. Why is this the case? What exactly is the type of art that we're defending on our side of the house? We're defending two types of art. First, art that depicts post-colonial suffering or conflict suffering, but more importantly, what we're defending is art that depicts current suffering. Why is that unique? We think within this material that Sally presents to you, what she's arguing is that constant suffering is always present for the oppressed within a group. Because it's present, the only way you can get them to buy into a political institution is by saying someday things will get better. It's this false hope that if you're able to persist through the suffering that you're currently experiencing, that one day liberation will magically occur, but without any actual concessions by the oppressors. We think if that's the case, which they have not refuted with at all, at best Katie says, I hope you win, I hope you win too, I hope you win too. Cool, bottom half. Anyway, so that's not cool. I'm sorry, I think I'm funny, I'm not. In terms of a culture of hope, it's actually a culture of false hope. And the idea that if I continue to persist and put up with the pain and suffering that I'm experiencing institutionally and culturally, that someday I'll be able to get access to enough political capital to change things institutionally. But the only problem is, it's a concession I have to make with my oppressor, but it never actually produces any meaningful institutional change. We think when that doesn't happen, when they don't prove that to you, we tell you that historically within the US, for example, liberation from Jim Crow laws has led to police brutality. We tell you that that chain or that like link of waiting and waiting and waiting never produces meaningful change. If that's the case, what you're putting on us is a false hope that things will change. But what we uniquely get on our side of the house when we depict suffering and constant suffering through art is that we remind ourselves that this constant suffering is present. It creates a cultural standard for ourselves, and we will not accept this constant suffering. Instead of believing that things are rosy and things will get better down the road, we see that we are suffering right now. We're actually more inclined to orient ourselves towards resolving those constant sufferings. So instead of making concessions for now, so we can get better change in the future, we demand change now and say, if the future comes, that's fine. But right now we're suffering. That's what we think we uniquely get on our side of the house with our art. Sally tells you that art, or opening opposition tells you that art has a unique visceral response on the individual. What Sally tells you is when you experience that through the collective lens, what happens is it shapes public perception and beliefs. At the point where you shape public perceptions and beliefs about the state of suffering, what you get is an accurate depiction of the power dynamics that currently exist, the power dynamics that produces states and conditions of oppression. We think when you get that accurate depiction, you're much more inclined to mobilize behind some type of social mobility in terms of like changing the current state and institutions that exist to oppress. We think that in terms of this transitionary period, because we can see there's a transitionary period and it's important, what we don't want to do is to re-entrench the new system in the same type of cycles of oppression that they will. Conversely, what we will do, even if it means it will take longer, even if it means that in the short term things will be more unstable, is that we want want to strive towards a future, a society where every individual has an equal part within that society. We recognize that both sides of the house, we're not going to create a utopia. But we say on our side of the house, at least we have the autonomy, the agency, and the liberty to say that we were a part of this, that we did not make concessions that dehumanize us for the sake of peace. And for those reasons, we are proud to oppose.